Have you ever wondered how a nation can dream of stretching from sea to shining sea, and then just a few years later, tear itself completely apart in a brutal, bloody civil war? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into. We're looking at the 33 most intense years in American history, from 1844 to 1877, a time that saw a nation born, then broken, and then kind of pieced back together again. You know, Abraham Lincoln totally saw it coming. Years before any shots were fired, he gave this warning that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And that division, that massive crack in the foundation of America, was all about one thing: slavery. Was this country going to be built on free labor or on the backs of enslaved people? Literally everything hinged on that single explosive question. But before the country split, there was this incredible unifying dream. See, back in the 1840s, this idea called manifest destiny was sweeping the nation. It was this powerful, almost religious belief that the U.S. was chosen by God to expand all the way across North America. And it turns out this grand dream of expansion would set the stage for an absolute national nightmare. Because here's the thing about that dream. It carried a question inside of it, a question so explosive that it would eventually blow the whole Union apart. And the first big move was war. You had President James K. Polk, who was all in on manifest destiny, and he was dead set on getting more land from Mexico. He pretty much picked a fight, and after 2 years, the United States came out on top with a huge game-changing victory. And wow, the prize was incredible. The treaty that ended the war forced Mexico to hand over a massive piece of land we call the Mexican Cession. This would become California, Nevada, Utah, you name it. And for just $15 million, that dream of a nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, it was suddenly real. But this victory immediately threw a question onto the table that nobody could ignore anymore. It was the question Congress had been kicking down the road for decades. What do we do with all this new land? Is it going to be free, or is it going to be slave? So that one question basically sets the stage for the entire 1850s, a decade of just one frantic, desperate attempt after another to patch the country together with political deals and compromises. So Congress's first big swing at this was the Compromise of 1850. And think of it like this massive, high-stakes balancing act. Okay, for the North, you get California as a free state. Good. But for the South, you get a really tough new Fugitive Slave Act, one that forced people in the North to help catch escaped slaves. It was a deal meant to give just enough to both sides to keep the whole thing from falling apart. But that's all it was. It was a temporary fix. I mean, really, it was like putting a tiny Band-Aid on a gaping wound. It didn't solve the deep, moral, and economic fight over slavery. It just bought a little more time. And boy, did things escalate fast. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 comes along with this idea that sounds kind of democratic, right? Popular sovereignty. Just let the settlers vote on whether to have slavery. The result? Total chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups flooded into Kansas, and it turned into a mini-civil war, a period we now call Bleeding Kansas. And this violence wasn't just out on the frontier. It literally spilled onto the floor of the U.S. Senate. The time for talking was over. People were fighting. Then, in 1857, the Supreme Court just dropped a bombshell. In the Dred Scott decision, the court ruled that African Americans weren't citizens and had no rights at all. And on top of that, it said Congress had no power to ban slavery in any U.S. territory. For the North, this was a disaster. It meant every compromise they'd ever made was now meaningless. The highest court in the land had just effectively made slavery legal everywhere. So think about it. The political system failed. The courts failed. The whole country was just a powder keg waiting for a spark, and one final event was about to light the fuse. And that spark? It was the presidential election of 1860. The country was so broken that there were 4 major candidates running for president. Even the Democratic Party had split in two, a northern one and a southern one, because they couldn't agree on slavery. So who wins? Abraham Lincoln. He's the candidate for the brand new Republican Party, running on a platform of stopping slavery from spreading. He gets the presidency with just 40% of the vote, and here's the kicker, not a single southern state voted for him. For the South, this was it. This was the final straw. A president had been elected who they saw as a direct threat to their entire way of life. The reaction was swift. I mean, immediate. Before Lincoln could even take office, South Carolina was out. They seceded. Other states followed right behind them, forming the Confederacy. And then, in April of 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter. The House, divided, had finally, violently fallen. And so it began, a war that would last 4 brutal years and completely remake the United States. Now, if you were just looking at the stats, you'd think this would be a quick fight. The Union in the North had way more people, way more factories, way more railroads. You get the picture. But the Confederate South had some key advantages. They were fighting on their home turf, and especially at the beginning of the war, they had some brilliant military leaders. And this is super important to remember. When the war started, Lincoln's #1 goal wasn't what you might think. He said it himself in 1862. His paramount object was to save the Union. It wasn't about saving or destroying slavery. That was the official reason for the war. But wars have a way of changing things. As this one dragged on, its very purpose began to shift. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, technically, it was a military order that only freed slaves in the states that were in rebellion, but its impact was revolutionary. It completely changed the meaning of the war. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now a war to end slavery. 4 years, over 620,000 lives lost, and the Union was saved. But the next job? Man, it might have been even harder. It was time for Reconstruction, the massive effort to rebuild the South and figure out what freedom actually meant for millions of newly freed people. And the only way to do this was to literally rewrite the rules of the country. So you get 3 huge changes to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment, that officially abolishes slavery everywhere. The 14th Amendment establishes that if you're born here, you're a citizen, and you get equal protection. And the 15th? It says you can't deny someone the right to vote based on their race. These were revolutionary changes. And for a little while, it was incredible. There was this burst of real progress. You had the Freedmen's Bureau helping people, and you had Black men voting and getting elected to high office. But the backlash was fierce, and it was violent. You saw the rise of these redeemer governments in the South, passing discriminatory Black codes, terrorist groups like the KKK spreading fear, and economic systems like sharecropping that were basically just a trap, keeping people in endless debt. So how did it all fall apart? You know, it wasn't some big final battle. It was a shady, backroom political deal. To settle a messy presidential election in 1876, the Republicans got to keep the White House, but they had to agree to pull the last federal troops out of the South. Once those soldiers were gone, the entire project of Reconstruction was officially over, and the long, dark era of Jim Crow segregation began. And just like that, it was done. The federal government walked away. Those incredible promises made in the 14th and 15th Amendments, promises written in the blood of the Civil War, were just left on the table unenforced for almost another 100 years. And that leaves us with this huge, lingering question that echoes through history. If the first attempt at building a real multiracial democracy failed in 1877, when and how would the second one even begin?